Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. As many of you may know, transit and transportation infrastructure is one of my passions, something that I'm extremely interested in. And I've been following a gentleman on Twitter that's really unbelievably knowledgeable about what's going on, very passionate as well in his beliefs as to what transit we should be investing in and the mistakes that are being made. And so therefore, I thought it'd be good to check in with him and find out what's going on in his world as far as transit is concerned. And so I want to introduce you to Stephen Wickens. He's a semi-retired journalist and a transit researcher. He's worked for 4 different Toronto papers since the 1970s. He's also known as the author of Station to Station, a recent independent report on the soaring costs of subway building in the Greater Toronto Area, done for the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. Stephen, welcome to our show. How are you, sir?
I'm great, and thanks for having me on. I really wish that I had better news for you or a more optimistic message, but it's an important discussion, and I actually enjoy following you on Twitter too. So this is good.
I appreciate it. So let's just, from an overview standpoint, where do you think we sit right now in our investment in the Greater Toronto Area in transit? What's your assessment?
It's not good. We're in the middle of a massive cost spiral. It's out of control. The public agencies, the politicians, and even a lot of the media seem to be ignoring it. It's sad because Toronto was, in the 60s and 70s, a place where people came from other countries to see how we did it. And the situation right now is that we haven't really done a transit infrastructure project well in more than 40 years. So it's not as long as the
Sorry, hold on. We haven't done a transit project infrastructure well in over 40 years?
More than 40 years. And so, yeah, it's not as long as the Maple Leaf Stanley Cup drought, but we're getting there.
So, that's a pretty negative assessment of Infrastructure Ontario, of Metrolinx, or the provincial government. What have we been doing wrong?
It's tough to distill it in down to something really small. But right now, for example, today I was on a conference call for the Regional Board of Trade released a report on how to use the existing transit infrastructure much better. And on that conference call, the CEO of Infrastructure Ontario made clear that we've already signed the contracts. They're not really officially ready to announce it, but signed the contracts for 2 transit projects whose costs are going to massively outweigh the benefits. And the tunneling contracts that we're signing are locking us in because they're so deep, really. There is no way. I mean, if I were to put this in simplest possible terms, for the second half of the 20th century, the costs of building subways didn't increase at all, if you account for inflation. The costs were flat. Since the turn of the century, 20 years ago, costs appear to have doubled now 3 times. So we're being expected to pay 8 times the historical average. It's out of control, and we've tried various things to try and get things under control, and we're not getting any closer.
That's amazing. 8 times increase in the cost of, is it primarily tunnels?
Tunnels lock us into a significant amount of the problem here. When we built subways in the 20th century, we relied really heavily on shallow cut and cover box tunnels, and that allowed the stations to be very small and close to the surface. It's not the only reason, but since we started using these big tunnel boring machines, they have to operate so deep below the surface that we're creating stations that are incredibly expensive. They're massive underground buildings. I don't think that's the only cause. When we built the Shepherd subway, it opened in 2002. People were alarmed that it cost twice as much as the historical average, and people decided, maybe we can't afford to build subways anymore, and we should build LRTs. And Mayor David Miller in Toronto rolled out the Transit City plan, which was going to be surface LRTs. But right now, even one of the projects that was included in Transit City, the Finch West LRT, is already going to cost as much per kilometer as the Shepherd subway. And the subway that we built in between the Toronto-York extension went massively over budget. Was such a scandal that the TTC got fired from subway building. We brought in Infrastructure Ontario and Metrolinx, and they were supposed to, use their P3 model to bring wrestle costs back down to a realistic number. And it's more like they've poured gasoline onto the fire.
Unbelievable. And these two projects that you say we're signing right now, the tunneling for right now, what are they?
That would be the Scarborough subway extension from Kennedy Station up to the Scarborough Town Center, which effectively replacing the SRT, and the western extension of the Eglinton Crosstown LRT. So
we're chatting tonight with Stephen Wickens, who is a transit expert about transit, but obviously, given this conversation right off the bat, dramatically 8 times increasing cost in the cost of building transit in the Greater Toronto Area. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Stephen and transit in just a minute. Stay with us, please. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Stephen Wickens. Stephen is a semi-retired journalist and a transit researcher. He's worked for a couple of different Toronto papers. He's an author of a report, Station to Station, on soaring costs of subway building. And we've just been talking about transit expenses, costs, et cetera. Stephen, let's talk about this deep boring machines versus the, I think you called it cut and cover box.
yeah.
Why is this? So we're going far deeper and using these boring machines because we don't want to disturb the streets. Is that the reason why?
That's a large part of it. And the tunnel boring machines are actually safer. I mean, when we built cut and cover subways, we had some bad accidents. I can mention, for example, that 9 people died in building the Bloor Danforth subway. We don't have a proper monument to them, but we should. But yeah,
that obviously that's terrible. But explain it if you could. So what is that? It's because the sides fall in or something?
I mean, I think it was more that there was heavy emphasis on cost cutting for the bidders.
Because we do excavation of big holes for buildings all the time. Why can't we excavate a tunnel?
We can. One of the things that we have to do if you use cut and cover is relocate utilities, and that's a bit more complicated. If you are using these deep bore tunneling machines, you can go right underneath the utilities. So that and there is some reduced disruption at the surface, but it's far from perfect. I mean, the people who've lived along Eglinton for the past few years have lived a nightmare.
It's been a disaster. And, I would have thought it was just as bad as cut and cover.
It's probably a little less messy for a lot of the route, but it takes a lot longer. And it's certainly a factor in the cost spiral that's out of control.
And so you say that it's primarily the stations. So it's not actually the boring, it's the stations. Why? Because you got to get down farther in the ground?
Yeah, I mean, we're building effectively 8-story underground buildings to get people to and from the surface. And I want to caution that it's not just the depth, and it's not just the size of the stations. There's clearly some other things going on here when now we've got light rail lines at the surface costing as much as subway did just a few years ago. But I think it's certainly more than coincidence that the costs started soaring when we started using these tunnel boring machines, for sure.
That's interesting. And, all the word is that Infrastructure Ontario and the 3P partnership process was going to be controlling costs and bringing them down. It sounds like either that hasn't happened or it would have been worse if we didn't have them.
It's not happening. And, when it comes to public-private partnerships, The ideological left doesn't want to have anything to do with them. The ideological right seems to be naively supportive of them. But somewhere in between is the truth. And P3s are really inevitable. Every subway ever built in the non-communist world is a public-private partnership to some degree and in some form.
Every subway?
Every subway. Yeah, I mean, you've had to, whether it's the public putting up most of the money, they're hiring private contractors to bid on jobs. So that partnership has always been there. It's had to evolve considerably since the first subway in the 1860s in London. The rise of car-dependent cities changed the economics considerably and made the private sector profitability much less by the 1920s. And that's why it became much more of a public-driven thing throughout most of the 20th century. But clearly the business model has fallen apart in recent decades. There's, I think, a reluctance on the part of a lot of people in car-dependent suburbs, for example, to subsidize transit. They don't think they see the benefit, although I would argue that in terms of congestion reduction, nothing does it better than public transit. So we're scrambling, looking for a new P3
and
model.
I certainly agree with you on public transit, but I guess if you're right on this massive increase in subway tunneling costs and station costs, really the issue is the type of transit we build.
I think it's that, and I think a lot of it is the bidding and procurement process. I think it's broken. I think that Metrolinx and Infrastructure Ontario they're learning on the job, and it's not going well. So
why is it broken? They brag that they are the best procurers of infrastructure the world's ever seen. How is it broken?
They've never built a subway before. We're getting close, I guess, on the Eglinton Crosstown project. But I'll give you an example. If they're bringing down costs, clearly they're failing in that regard. But it appears they're broken more so in that they are not telling the government what it needs to hear. They're not speaking truth to power.
In regards to how expensive it really is.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that the opposition politicians and the agencies and that are pretty quiet. There's part of me that's wondering why I'm not hearing Doug Ford saying, something along the lines of, I'll ream them out at Metrolinx and Infrastructure Ontario to find out why we can't get a better price on this. Because these costs are totally out of control.
So, you in your report, you had some interesting statistics that it might be worthwhile just reviewing to put things in context. You said that in 1949, the Yonge subway was built. Yeah.
Well, that's when we started construction. Yeah.
And then in 1996, a short extension was put in place to Shepherd.
Yeah. So the point that I was making on those is that between 1949 and 1996, the costs didn't rise at all if you account for inflation. In real dollars, the costs are flat. And
then you say the Shepherd subway, just 2 years later or a few years later in 2002, cost twice as much.
Twice as much as the historical average. And then the Toronto York extension cost 4 times as much as the historical average. And the next round of projects, we've got, the Scarborough and North Yonge extensions in particular are looking seriously like they might now be twice again as much as the York Spadina extension, or 8 times the historical average.
That's just astounding.
Yes.
The cost is escalated. So let's talk about a couple of these projects. So, the York extension, did it make sense?
Certainly as far as York University, it did. North of York University, it's pretty well nothing more than, I guess, a relief line for the Barrie-Go corridor, which doesn't need relief just yet.
Yeah.
Again, it was probably a political decision, and this is where a lot of the problem seems to be coming in. We've got politicians choosing projects and then using the experts at Metrolinx to justify the decisions already made by the politicians. And
so I've ridden that extension a few times.
Yeah.
I'm shocked at how few people were on the subway car with me. Now, that's not a sample size that's very scientific. What are the statistics? Do you know what is ridership like north of York University?
It's very low. 2 of the 3 least used subway stations on the Toronto system are among the new 6 stations that opened there. Downsview Park and Highway 407 station. The other station that's the least used is on the Shepherd subway, Bessarion. So yeah, I mean, it's crazy that we were building lines longer when we have parts of the system that are massively overloaded, and we haven't built anything new in the core of Toronto in more than 50 years now.
Okay, so we talked about the York, and you say that it's got 2 of the worst, lowest ridership stations.
Yeah.
And you're worried that it was made for political purposes. What about the Scarborough subway extension?
Even worse. I would, for a long time, the debate in Toronto was subway or LRT for the Scarborough project. I would say that the subway and the LRT are at best the 3rd and 4th best solutions for connecting Kennedy Station with the Scarborough Town Centre. The best solution, if cost is your only concern, was one that was recommended by Dr. Richard Soberman, former former chair of civil engineering at U of T. He did a lot of the seminal reports for the TTC back in the 60s and 70s, actually it's even into the 80s. And that was basically to repair the SRT. It means rebuilding a bend and buying new rolling stock, and that line could have run on. The other option that I think is probably providing the best combination of cost and transit improvements for Scarborough would be to use the GO Regional Express Rail expansion project, which is already ongoing, and do a short 1 kilometer spur off the Stouffville line into Scarborough Town Centre. The report that the Regional Board of Trade produced today makes the point that we have massive amounts of potential capacity on the GO rail corridors that we're not using, and that would have been the best way of doing it. But by Metrolinx's own assessment, on their benefits cost analysis, the costs of this Scarborough subway extension are far more than the benefits will be.
So I don't understand. So why does it end up getting, built? And then the political thing is, Scarborough deserves their subway. And I've been to Vancouver. I used to work in Vancouver. The Sky Trains, the Canada lines, which are effectively, I think, LRTs in the sky, work fine, work well. Why couldn't we get this technology working in Scarborough?
We can. In fact, the technology in Scarborough is the same as the SRT, but it's a newer generation of it. Subways sell. They
sell, but I think what it is that former Mayor Rob Ford and then Doug Ford sort of were all on this subways, because clearly grade separated from the traffic is key. When you're in a bus or a streetcar, an LRT, and you're stuck in traffic and you're going slower than cars, then you're not going to ride transit. But if you're either below the cars or above the cars, you can go faster than transit. So it's grade separation that's the key.
Grade separation is essential. You can make at-grade LRT work. It requires really serious signal priority for the transit at grade. We don't have any examples in Toronto to show anybody, and so people use, St. Clair or Spadina as the examples to denigrate the possibility of.
And they don't go, I've been on those. You've probably been on those. They don't go faster than car traffic unless the car traffic is really rush hour jammed up.
Yeah. We did not do either St. Clair or Spadina very well.
So at one point in time, there was a proposal, and TTC had it. The Neptis Foundation I can't remember when that came out, but that was before John Tory's 10 years mayor, came out with a recommendation to take the SRT, a elevated LRT, all the way from Kennedy Station to Scarborough Town Center, and then back along the 401 or Shepherd, connect in with the end of the Shepherd subway station, and create a circle at the northeast quadrant of the city. Yeah. Why wasn't that done?
I don't think it actually makes a lot of sense. If you're going to do the SRT and you're going to extend it out to Malvern to help those people more in outer Scarborough. If you're going to loop something in with the Shepherd subway, it's the relief line or the Ontario line that really makes a lot of sense in that regard.
Okay, so let's talk about the Ontario line. What do you think of it? It's going to be tunneled, I believe, and it's going to be more like train technology than LRT technology. So it's going to be even a bigger tunnel, I would presume.
It's a mixture of tunneled and above ground in the current plan, but it's considered a really light metro. And you probably remember the Canada line from Vancouver and how massively overcrowded that became very shortly after it opened. I fear we're making the same mistake here. These trains are going to be much smaller than regular Toronto subways. There has been claims that they're going to get trains on a 90-minute headway. So that's the space between 90 seconds between trains, and that's just unrealistic. The places in the world that have been able to do 90 seconds don't do it in rush hour when you need it, and they do it with brutally the doors close whether you like it or not. That's just not something that we're going to accept in North America. It's unsafe.
Really? That's interesting.
But yeah, the Ontario, the one line that we should not be trying to save nickels and dimes on is the new line through the core, because the core part of the system is massively overwhelmed, at least pre-pandemic. But that's the line that we're apparently going to try to save a bit of money on.
How? By what?
But by putting some of it above ground through
the center of the city?
Through the Riverdale and Riverside area of the city. They plan to put that above grade, and there's some areas in East York that they plan to put above grade as well. If they want to save money, there's absolutely no way that the Eglinton West extension on the crosstown should be tunneled at all. There are better ways. And I would say both the North Yonge extension and the Scarborough extension, where the GO corridors are better positioned to connect Richmond Hill and Scarborough with downtown than the subway is. Those are already overloaded subways, and we're not.
Well, and in addition, I don't understand. No businessman and a lot of people aren't going to take a dozen, if not 20 stations to go from Richmond Hill to Union Station or somewhere along Bloor Danforth on a subway. When on the GO train, you can be down there, and what is there? 3 GO train stations if you had frequent travel on that line. Similarly, I've been pleasantly surprised at how many people take the Up Express from Weston, and you're downtown with one stop. And, the comparable would be, I counted up once, I think it was 30 stops on an Eglinton crosstown and a subway to get downtown if you were taking the Eglinton crosstown and then the subway.
Yeah. One of the keys for making GO's corridors workable as a real alternative to the subway is getting the fare integration process down pat. I would suggest that any trip for example, within Toronto, that begins and ends in Toronto, be a TTC fare, whether it include a leg on GO Transit or not. And similarly, in Mississauga, if the trip begins and ends within Mississauga, it should be just one flat Mississauga fare, even if it includes a segment on GO Transit. And
I'm a real fan of zone pricing. And you go to Paris, you go to London, you go to most major cities in the world, New York, etc. You get fair pricing, not necessarily in New York on the subways, but you do get it on the Long Island Railway and the New Jersey transit system. Yeah.
I mean, there are various ways of making fare integration work. We've been talking about it for a long time and not making a lot of progress. I think it's an opportunity now during the COVID era for us to rebuild transit ridership with some experimentation on our fare integration. And
I got to tell you, it upsets me when I take Mississauga Transit to get to the GO train and take the GO train to get to Union Station, then take the TTC, and I'm paying 3 different fares.
Yeah. And I mean, there are ways around this. Lots of places in the world have done this. And with an electronic fare collection system, it really shouldn't be very difficult at all. Presto's not a good fare collection system, but it's still within the realm of possibility.
So the Oyster card, or whatever it's called in London, has something like over 30 different companies, both private and public, different entities that all get revenue from the one card. Yeah. And they divvy it up between, street level buses, subways, and trains.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter which service you're using within London. It matters where the actual trip that you're making.
Which makes sense.
It's quite a smart system. Transit's not cheap in London, but yeah, it's a far.
Have you tried to park in the city of London?
No, actually, when I'm in Britain, I steer clear of driving because I don't like driving on the left-hand side of the road.
It's the congestion, the driving, and the parking is pretty expensive and outrageous. So transit and the taxis are pretty expensive. So transit is the right solution. Yeah. We're chatting tonight with transit expert Stephen Wickens. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with his solutions for transit in the Greater Toronto Area in just a minute. Stay with us. Okay. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio while we're on Saga 960. I have been really interested in transit for a long period of time. I think it is one of those things that makes a city work. I have done a fair amount of study on this. I was chairman of the Mississauga Summit, which had movement as one of its key tenets, and trying to figure out how to get people moving around the Greater Toronto Area and from home to work. And we Stephen, you may know, did a lot of work on Regional Express Rail at that time, and thinking through both the Lakeshore line and the Mississauga Milton line, and how we could get all-day two-way frequent GO train service on those lines and benefit our communities dramatically. And then for the last 8 years, I've been on the board of something called Transit Alliance, which is a civic advocacy organization in Toronto that has been advocating for transit. And for the last 4 years or so, I've been the chair of that organization, in addition to my interviews of people like you on this radio show. So transit has been critically important to me. However, given COVID-19, people have been self-selecting away from transit. Transit ridership is down dramatically. Supposedly the fare box was, maybe it's changed now, but was down like 80% during the first months of COVID-19. People have been shying away from being on GO trains and subway cars and buses and things like that, at least if they can. In China, supposedly car ownership is up by something like 40%, as people are choosing to go back to the private car rather than rely on transit because of public health concerns. What do you think the implications of COVID-19 are on our transit system, sir?
I would say that in general, with the uncertainty about rebuilding transit ridership and the absolute certainty that deficits and debts are going to be soaring, sooner or later, we're going to have to get a lot more selective about what we build in terms of transit infrastructure, and a lot smarter about how we build it. And I also think that we're going to have to, we'd certainly would be wise to focus a lot more on operations than new capital projects. And that's even if, and I know politicians don't find operations very exciting, increasing the frequency of a bus, as opposed to promising a subway. But that's where it really is. You don't build transit, you build transit infrastructure, but you operate transit. And if people can rely on buses, and if they know they don't have to wait more than 5 or 10 minutes for that bus, it does become attractive even in suburban areas. Jonathan English, who actually wrote that report for the Toronto Regional Board of Trade, did his PhD looking at the successes of Toronto's suburban bus routes, which, many of the most used transit routes in all of North America, surface transit routes in all of North America, are TTC buses. We complain about them, but it's the best bus service in North America.
I can't believe anyone did their PhD on suburban bus service in Toronto.
Well, listen, Jonathan English is actually a pretty interesting writer too. He makes his reports quite readable. So yeah, that's not something that most people would touch. And let's face it, people kvetch about the quality of transit even in the cities with the best transit. So it's.
But do you think people are going to go back to using transit once COVID's over?
Yeah, it's going to take some time. And I think people are going to be using masks a lot more. I have a friend who has to do a lot of business trips to the Far East, spends a lot of time in Hong Kong and Tokyo. And, for years, he'd come back to Toronto. He said he always felt weird getting on the subway without a mask because it was the accepted thing to do over there. And I think it's probably going to be the accepted thing here. There's pretty good evidence from a lot of cities that people riding the subways are not much more vulnerable to COVID than people who are traveling by other means, as long as they're masked and as long as they're spaced out. The problem, of course, comes in that a lot of the efficiencies of the transit systems that we rely on crowding. And so,
yeah, I've rarely been on transit during rush hour that is spaced out. It's always crowded.
Yeah. And, again, within Toronto, we've had such crowding for so long on the inner parts of the subway system that we don't even really know what the real demand is, including the latent demand. So.
Well, there's this great concept that you're undoubtedly aware of in transportation of the S-curve, where as you increase supply, demand will increase slowly at first, and then you get to an inflection point where as you increase supply, demand increases dramatically, and then it levels off and you increase supply even more. And supply is often thought of as not just new routes, but more importantly, frequency, that you don't get the big benefit. And it's thought of as that value or that inflection point is somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. And so it's the amount of time where you no longer need to look at a schedule to know when the train's going. You just walk down because you know it's coming sometime soon.
Absolutely.
And, the subways in Toronto, which I think are about every 5 or 7 minutes, have achieved that, where you go downstairs. You don't look at a schedule to see when you're going to go downstairs. But the GO trains, you look, because if you miss one, you're waiting a long time.
Yeah, right now that's the case. But once we get, I guess they're calling it GO expansion now, but Regional Express Rail was the term when it was a project under the Wynne government. But when you're looking at all day, two-way, 15-minute service, it suddenly becomes pretty attractive. And on some of those routes where you've got two lines from the outer exurban area coming together, suddenly 15-minute service where you've got two lines coming together, you've actually got 7.5-minute service. That's pretty good. And it provides, some real opportunity. What Metrolinx and Go Transit have to be thinking of, however, is that this improved service will also drive up operating costs. And what you want to be getting to is new revenue outweighing the new operating costs. I can't
If
see
you've got an existing line and you've got existing rolling stock and all you're doing is using it more often, that's pretty efficient use of assets.
Absolutely, it's a much more efficient use of assets. But again, you're using your capital better. But again, those operating costs, when you need twice as many drivers to double your service, you certainly want to be getting considerably more fair revenue coming in as well.
Stephen, you mentioned that you were concerned about the cost of the Finch West LRT.
Yeah.
What about the Huron-Taylor LRT? What's your sense of cost there?
I wish I could give you a straight answer. And it's not for lack of trying. I've tried to get these details when I was doing the report for the station-to-station report. But in short, Infrastructure Ontario says the public is not allowed to know, and honest. The Huron-Tario line
is not allowed to know. I thought government worked for us.
Well, yeah, you're asking the right question. The Huron-Tario line, like the original plan for the Hamilton LRT, the costs are cloudy because they've lumped in 30 years of operations and maintenance as well. And so I tried to get Infrastructure Ontario to break those out so that we could get a per kilometer figure. And both when I tried it, Infrastructure in Ontario and Metrolinx, they refused to give it. Metrolinx at one point said that they can't provide those figures because they're commercially sensitive for the bidders, which to me is pretty outrageous because the public and the politicians need those figures to do some comparison shopping.
But your sense is that it's probably along the lines of this 8 times more expensive than transit was in the prior to 2000.
Yeah. I mean, it's again, I can't give you a specific figure, but this this obfuscation about when it comes to providing specific costs allows the agencies to hide waste. It appears even that they're more concerned with protecting the commercial sensibilities of the bidders than they are getting value for the public.
Stephen, you've been researching and writing about transit for a couple of decades.
Yeah.
It seems kind of messed up. If you were going to change it, what would you do?
I would start by restructuring the relationship between the agencies and the politicians. We need to free our experts to speak truth to power and speak truth to power in public. Metrolinx and Infrastructure Ontario, I think they should be answering to the legislature as a whole, as opposed to the cabinet of the governing party. It's not just the Ford government that appears to be abusing power. The Wynne and McGuinty governments did the same thing, and I have no reason to believe that the NDP would be any better. But
it also seems that it's not just politicians in Queen's Park. It's every mayor has a different transit plan.
Yeah. The problem there.
Campaign on it. Smart.
Yeah.
Truck.
You got to keep the politicians out of the planning process, at least in the early stages, because what's happening is politicians are making decisions right off the bat.
I just don't see that politicians are involved in where airports go or where highways go. Or maybe I'm naive. Are they?
Yeah. I think they are to some degree, but yeah, it's again this power to buy votes with a promise of a subway project really seems to be quite powerful. And when politicians make these promises, they're reluctant to back down or reluctant to even consider other options that often make a lot more sense. So if you can keep the politicians out of the process until real independent experts have had a chance to assess what the problems to be solved are and create a menu of options.
Okay, so we're going to politicians out of the process. What else? Would you go with more elevated LRTs like the SRT and the SkyTrain, or what?
I would certainly go elevated on Eglinton West. Years ago, I was at a public meeting when there was talk of the Shepherd LRT line, and I was stunned that the TTC and city politicians were so deaf to the concerns of people in Scarborough who were suggesting, that maybe we might put this Shepherd East LRT elevated. When we build subways, those cities around the world that have those subway maps that make Canadians envious are cities where they're not stupid enough to tunnel for subways in their suburban areas. 55% of the London Underground is actually above ground. The tourists don't see this, but
sorry, what'd you say? 55% of the underground is above ground?
Yeah, the London Underground, 55% of it is above ground. And in Hong Kong, 63% of the MTR is above ground. These are known as subway systems. Even in Toronto, when we were good at building subways way back when, we didn't bother tunneling half of the original Yonge line. From Bloor to Eglinton, that was an open trench.
Yeah.
We covered it up in a few spots since, but
well, the Boston subway system has substantial amounts where outside of the core they come up, and they're actually LRTs that run underneath the central core and then come up and spread out across the city.
That's right. Yeah, the Green Line does that in Boston. Probably more than half. I can't remember the specific number for New York. Their subway system is above ground. But what we're doing now is we're insisting on these deep, not just subway tunnels, but deep bore subway tunnels in Scarborough and North Yonge Street, and it makes no sense. And you would think that with the brand of a conservative government would be focused on doing things cost effectively, and it's not. It's spare all costs. We're looking to save nickels and dimes on the core part of the Ontario line, but it's money's no object.
We're chatting tonight with Stephen Wickens, who is a transit expert. He's been a reporter. He's been a writer with 4 different papers. I'm going to have to ask you about that sometime. That sounds fascinating. And a researcher and writer about transit issues for several decades. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us, please.
Cool.
Welcome back to a fascinating conversation that I'm having. I'm really enjoying it with Stephen Wickens, who's got me a little bit discouraged about the price increases, the cost increases in transit that he says has gone up 8-fold on inflationary adjusted dollars since prior to 2000. And that the other big mistakes that we make is we allow politics to play too much of a role in transit planning, and that we're doing too much deep bore tunneling rather than thinking about above ground LRTs or elevated LRTs. Stephen, given everything we've talked about and that you are concerned about the increased cost of the Hurontario LRT, what recommendations would you have for us in Mississauga?
I would start, by looking at having Mississauga fund its own loop. The main loop through the Mississauga City Center that the province cut out to save some money on the LRT project. I think those stops have the potential to be the most important on the entire line and crucial to the success of it. It wouldn't be unprecedented for a city to do that. When Toronto, again, when Toronto built its original subway, the Yonge University and the original Bloor Danforth lines, it funded nearly all of it by itself. And so I think that in the case of Mississauga, trying to fund that loop and build it yourself, loop it into the LRT is probably going to be a really good investment in Mississauga investing in itself the same way Toronto invested in itself in the 50s and 60s. The other thing that I would do, and it's not just Mississauga, I would say all the municipalities in the 905 have got to get a lot smarter about encouraging development of lands around the GO stations and the LRT stops. That first 5-minute walk from those stations is essential to developing the two-way demand that really makes good transit service worthwhile. And every time office buildings or college campuses or hospitals or whatever go to highway interchanges, it's a real loss for the city as a whole. I know that you probably know Ed Sajecki, the former chief planner of Mississauga. He's worked really hard to make Mississauga city center a vibrant place, but a lot of it is still, I guess, overly residential. And so if you can get a lot of the job growth into Mississauga city center and rebuild that loop, I think the future could be really quite bright for Mississauga.
Well, I'll give you my two suggestions. I think rather than the loop, because I think that's going to be frustrating for a lot of people that are traveling past the city center. But I think, again, going back to an elevated LRT, I think if you actually elevated it, what you could do is you could take it over Square One to the Living Arts Center and then back over the 403 to rejoin Huron, Ontario. And so it's sort of halfway between a loop and the straight line that you've got right now. You can't do that with the current at grade LRT. And the other thing that I think you should do is, since Brampton doesn't want it coming all the way through Brampton, I think what you should do is, and frankly, I don't think that many people are going to go from Mississauga to Brampton anyway. I think what you should do is take it across Derry to the airport. And if it connected from Square One or from Port Credit to Square One to North Mississauga to the airport, I think people would use it. And I think that would be one of the keys.
Yeah, I threw that out there because that was a plan that was already in place and some work's been done on it. But I guess more than anything, don't be afraid in Mississauga to invest in yourselves, because when Toronto invested in itself, it really did pay off.
Stephen Wickens, it's been a pleasure chatting with you about transit. I love some of your ideas. I'm worried about your assessment of cost, and I think smart guys like you need to continue researching and reporting on the issues in transit and our investments in the Greater Toronto Area. So thank you so much.
We'll do our best, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak about this. A lot of fun.
A lot of fun. Well, that's our show for tonight. I come to you every Monday through Friday at 7 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, and you can get all my podcasts and video casts after the fact on briancrombie.com, on YouTube, on Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts. Have a great evening, everyone. Thanks, Stephen. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.